This is your 11th lecture for your Introduction to Philosophy, and in this lecture we'll be looking at Immanuel Kant and his teachings of moralism.
Of all the lectures that you're going to have this semester, this may be the one that you need to listen to 2 or 3 or maybe more times. Kant is a very complicated, not so much in his biographical life to understand, but in his philosophical life, very difficult to understand for some people, because he is going to take a very different approach from those who came before him, as you're about to see. Although he will be connected certainly to what has come before him. Just to point out here the significance of Immanuel Kant to philosophy, there's been a lot of discussion I've noticed on sports shows lately about the Mount Rushmore of basketball players. You know, who would be on your Mount Rushmore of basketball players? And everyone agrees that Michael Jordan's on there, perhaps Bill Russell, and then the argument for many has been whether LeBron James would be one of the four greatest basketball players of all time, whether he would be on that Mount Rushmore. So I started thinking, what about Mount Rushmore of philosophers? Now, without a doubt, I think you know from earlier in the semester, we couldn't challenge Plato or Aristotle. Plato and Aristotle would certainly be 2 of the 4 on the Mount Rushmore of philosophers. And the more I've been thinking about that question, I do think Immanuel Kant would certainly be a finalist, if not definitely one of the figures that would have to be on the Mount Rushmore of philosophers. And one of the primary reasons is he's taking all of those modern or Enlightenment philosophies that have come right before him, like the rationalism of Descartes or the empiricism of John Locke, as you just saw, the skepticism of David Hume, and all of those ideas really are, by the early to mid 18th century, they're still somewhat seedlings. They really haven't grown past their introductory teachings. And it will be the philosophy, it will be the teachings of Immanuel Kant that kind of not only bring these ideas to maturity, but also in a way kind of brings them together into a singular reality. Now here is the big radical shift that we have with Immanuel Kant. And as often happens with philosophy, the new thing that Kant's going to point out is something that is actually quite obvious, but oftentimes it's the obvious thing that we overlook, that we have certain presuppositions that we never think about questioning them. And here is what Kant is going to question. He notices that all of these Enlightenment philosophies that had come before him, they all, even though they disagree with one another, they all do treat the mind like a passive sponge, that all that the mind can do is to absorb the truth and knowledge that it takes in, whether through rationalism like Descartes or empiricism like John Locke. And even Hume, that's the only way that Hume viewed the mind, was something that the mind is this passive sort of sponge that simply observes and takes in and absorbs knowledge. Of course, the only difference with Hume was that he didn't feel that the mind was a very effective sponge, that it wasn't able to know as much as Descartes and Locke had claimed. And so here comes our big turn with Kant. Kant questions this idea of the mind being simply a passive sponge that takes in knowledge, and Kant presents the human mind as an active and creative entity that actually plays a role in determining knowledge, creating knowledge and truth, rather than just absorbing information and allotting that data into certain mental categories, as David Hume had argued. Certainly Kant does recognize those same categories, but Kant has a much more active and creative role for those categories to play in the mind. So rather than the mind simply observing and absorbing knowledge, Kant is saying that the mind is actively playing a creative role in what knowledge and truth are. And one of Kant's earliest and most important concepts is what is called the transcendental idea. And this is bridging together 2 different realities. One reality is the one that we can speak of quite easily, and that's phenomenal reality. Phenomenal reality means this is the reality as we experience it. So whatever our experiences of reality are, this would be called the phenomenal reality. But there is a more ultimate and actual reality that we don't directly experience, and we do have Kant referring to this as the noumenal reality. So if we have our limited phenomenal reality, that's our personal experience, and we're trying to relate that to the ultimate, absolute, actual reality, the noumenal reality, or the objective reality, How can we connect these two things? And Kant points out that the mind has this capability of transcendental ideas that can bridge our limited experience to what is objective and actual. Now, this argument is made in one of two written works that you're going to be responsible to know about relating to Immanuel Kant. And this text is called The Critique of Pure Reason, and this is where we are introduced to this concept of the transcendental idea. Okay, besides The Critique of Pure Reason, the other written work that you're responsible to know about is The Critique of Practical Reason. And here we have Immanuel Kant moving into the area that he's most well known for, and that is his philosophy of ethics or morality. Now, we do see that Kant agrees with Hume concerning the relationship between metaphysics and God, that there really isn't any point to try to prove rationally or empirically that God exists. So that's how Hume was an agnostic, and based upon metaphysical grounds, again, trying to prove the existence of God, Kant would be in complete agreement with Hume here. But Kant does move forward in Critique of Practical Reason to talk about another reason that could be suggested to believe in God, that even though you cannot perhaps prove the existence of God, the idea that humanity has tended toward becoming ethical or moral beings points to a source for that morality, which could be called God. And so again, even though we're not able to provide a proof for God, the God of the Bible or any other deity for that matter, Kant argued that rather than living as isolated individuals, the fact that we have developed into societies, and within those societies there are particular moral norms or ethical expectations in our relationships with one another, this, according to Immanuel Kant, is enough to at least grant legitimacy to the idea of there being a God who has created the world populated by moral, or you may even argue immoral, human beings. Now, Kant becomes quite important here as the major representative of what we today term deontological ethics or non-consequential ethics. Now, as its primary competitor, we have the following lecture is going to introduce you to teleological ethics or utilitarianism, often called consequentialist ethics. So let me just summarize these terms for you once more before we move into what they actually mean. Kant represents deontological or non-consequentialist ethics. Over against that, in the next lecture, you're going to be introduced to consequentialist ethics, also known as teleological ethics or utilitarianism. Now, here is what we mean by deontological. This is a law-based or rule-based form of ethics in which you are not allowed to exercise any sort of conviction that says as long as you arrive at a good end, at a good ending to whatever the moral dilemma is, it doesn't matter whatever means you have used to reach that end. So nothing matters ethically or morally in the process of arriving at a good end. That is what the teleological or utilitarianism will present as the way to practice ethics. That hey, it doesn't matter. It doesn't matter whatever you have to do as long as you arrive at a good ethical moral ending. This idea we oftentimes hear is the end justifies the means. Well, not according to Immanuel Kant. Immanuel Kant would argue with deontological ethics that the end never justifies the means, that the entire ethical process, the entire moral process is based in laws and rules that must be adhered to, and you're not allowed to bend the rule. You're certainly not allowed to break away from the rule, because that in and of itself would make that an immoral process. Okay, and remember, your next lecture is going to present the opposite viewpoint of utilitarianism, that it doesn't matter what you do in the means as long as you arrive at the good end. By the way, before I move on to our last slide, I did want to present you with a chance for a bonus question on your reading quiz here. Let's take the name Immanuel Kant, his first name, Immanuel. We are almost into the season of Advent, which will be followed by Christmas on the Christian calendar, for those of you who are perhaps part of that faith. This term Immanuel actually comes from the Hebrew language, from a passage in the Hebrew Bible in Isaiah 7 that says that there's going to be someone sent who will be known as Immanuel. And then, according to the Christian tradition, Jesus of Nazareth is seen as the fulfillment by many of this presence of Immanuel. So my question for you is, what does the word Immanuel mean? During that season of Advent that's coming up soon, people in Christian churches will be singing a hymn called O Come, Immanuel, spelled differently with an E instead of an I, but still has the same meaning. So if you can email me what the name Immanuel means, you'll get an extra 10 points on your reading quiz. Okay, as we delve a bit further into Immanuel Kant's ethics, we need to talk about his teaching of imperatives. But before we get to the 3 imperatives that you're responsible to know about, I want you to understand that these are all based upon the fact that Kant placed an extremely high value on personhood. It doesn't matter what your standing in society was, except for gender. I'll say more about that in just a moment. Kant is speaking only of men here. But whether that man is unemployed, or whether that man has a very high position in government, whether that man is poor, whether that man is wealthy, for Kant, just being a person is what gives you great value and dignity and a certain standing in society. And it shouldn't be based upon what is oftentimes seen as making one person more important than another. Kant said just being a person is enough. Now, unfortunately, it is gender specific here. We see that women continue to be treated like property all the way into the 21st century, when we start to have some suffragette movements and some equal rights movements. And just like I kind of scoff at those who suggest that racism is over simply because things may be better today than they certainly were during the time of slavery. That is a joke to consider that racism does not exist anymore. Racism is still very, very prevalent in our culture. I would say the same thing about sexism, that sexism is still extremely prevalent in our culture, even though things may be better now than they were in an earlier day. So returning back to the issue of simply being a person, allowing you a certain, or conferring upon you a certain level of dignity, this then means within society there must be certain ethical guidelines that we follow to ensure that there is justice between persons, so that we do have a just society. And these guidelines or principles will be known as Kant's imperatives. Now, the first imperative that we're going to talk about is the hypothetical imperative. And a hypothetical imperative means that when you're facing a particular circumstance or situation, you are allowed to take into account what those certain circumstances are in making your moral decision and determining what behavior on your part will lead to justice, or the most just outcome. So hypothetical imperative means, of course, the word hypothesis. You're able to look at the circumstances, you're able to look at the details of a particular situation, and you take those into account when determining what the correct ethical or moral decision will be. Okay, next, and I can certainly guarantee a question about this on your final exam, because it is Kant's most famous teaching of all his many teachings, and that is the categorical imperative. In some ways, it seems to mirror the teaching called the Golden Rule, that you are to do unto others as you would have them do unto you. Unlike the hypothetical imperative, there is no need to take circumstances or details of a situation into an account here. The categorical imperative instead says that this is a right behavior that is so right, that is so just, that no matter who you are or where you are, universally, that would always be the right decision. That would always be the ethically or moral right decision. So you need to act in your relationship toward others in such a way that you're striving for that categorical imperative, that action, that behavior is always going to be the right and just action in that particular place, or any place, toward that particular person or toward any person anywhere. And that is the categorical imperative. And lastly, we arrive at the practical imperative. And here Kant points out that while people can function as a means to us, that people can have a certain utility, a certain use that they have for us, it is important that that is not to be seen as the only value that person has, that we are to see people just in and of themselves, that person is not a means to an end, but the person is also an end. Now, here's the example that the author of your textbook gives. It's a fine example here, that I can view students as a part of my income, that you all pay RCC to come to school and take these classes, and RCC turns around and pays me. So you have that utility use to me, that because you're going to pay RCC money, RCC is going to pay me money, so you are a means to an end for me. And likewise, you could view me the same way, that you are using the things that I provide you in this class to achieve the end of graduating, getting a diploma, eventually getting a job. So you are using the material that I provide to reach a particular end. So I'm a means to an end for you also. So it works both ways there. But what Kant says is even more important, is that even though we can recognize that people might serve a particular utility for us to achieve something or to gain something, it is just as important, perhaps more important to Immanuel Kant, that we see people simply as an end in and of themselves, that we treat people as having value simply because they are people. And that is the practical imperative, to never reduce a person down to only being a means to an end.